the time being.
Is it a hard time?
Okay. Camera is on.
Okay. Oh, we're starting at 9:45 here. A second.
All right, Greg, you're good.
All right.
I'll probably switch that so it's
If we're in trouble with any of the electronics or technology, how do we get in touch with you?
I'll just be next door, no further than next door.
Well, the stakes aren't that high anyway, right?
Well, you could wait.
Yeah, we'll just try to. No great harm will be done either way. John, did you do much with Bayard Rustin and?
No, you thought about me. You knew who he was as part of the whole
Yeah,
civil rights thing.
yeah.
I remember very vividly one time when we were dealing with civil rights in the American Religion class. And John Lyles was,
Yeah.
he was on, just spur of the moment, I said, John, would you mind if civil class has your experiences?
Anyway, she said, really,
Those students, nothing happened in class.
I can see my
And it's not, wow, man,
Yeah.
one Sunday he said,
Well, that's why.
something important, by modern standards, incredible.
Yeah.
Next Sunday, he came out in the street, Stedman and another brother and his wife and John put out of the man. And this is before the presbytery dissolved the relationship. So he has that kind of prophetic experience. And in many respects, John was no problem.
Yeah,
But he just did the right thing.
Yeah, that's nice. You hope not to miss that moment. You really do the right thing for a long time. Oh, too late.
This thing,
I mean, what I like about this little anecdote is just how, and I can't really, I feel it's not something I necessarily quite want to read, but I like that. I just like how discombobulated the police are by Rustin. They can't comprehend it. Yeah, they're just like incomprehending. And so it's that kind of moment of incomprehension and counterintuitive.
Yes.
That is what I find really interesting about this. One of the interesting kind of completely random facts about this, and that's my own annotation. This fellow on the bus who saw Rustin interacting with the police was Ben West, who went on as the mayor of Nashville. So.
and this is the little guy who said, I'm here to see you get justice. I say, I haven't gotten any for you.
Yeah. So, and West, I think, was basically a decent character.
Turns out, a little less deflectional.
Yeah. Well, and that may have been, partly to, do the West. I don't know.
Well, the Vanderbilt has something to do with it.
Yeah, well, and he had Lawson, Jim Lawson, at least he was there until he got thrown out of it. I've got to watch, so we can start up here.
And they're supposed to, there's a clock.
You know, something has a situation clock. After the reading, so if you're listening to the professor, you turn around, you're done for.
Yeah, that's it. You give yourself away, definitely. They were thinking about that.
So, what you,
Yeah,
Let's do an experiment. Start things off.
Yeah, that might, I could just turn on the gas and see what happens.
She was so
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I may not mess with it right now.
Who married his
Yeah.
and Sarah were, I thought them when they were in graduate school. She introduced him to the
During the store. What was this in?
I was in the Time on Two Crosses, which was his, it was an autobiography, just his collection of short writings. Yeah, I should have put that in there. Is it in there?
You read it?
And you read yours.
I'll teach you.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't take the every speed reading class.
Well, you know that great Woody Allen line about reading War and Peace in 17 minutes. Did that one. He said it's about right.
She likes the book.
Forgot that.
Throw my coffee.
That's right. Well, you're gonna get, I have these in due
Principles that I have.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have plenty.
You don't have to. Not as large.
Who was doing last week?
The rabbi T.
Oh, okay.
She did a
Did
job.
Yeah.
She had on a red dress and a red yarn. So you kind of careful. Wash.
By the end of her 4 sessions, I decided we're all Jews and she's a Christian.
Oh.
They just kind of all came together.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So she did 4 sections. Then.
3.
3.
3.
Yeah, she's doing it.
Where did you?
Well, we go back and forth to New Jersey.
Always
Have a home
Tony
and,
was the one.
our youngest daughter and her family, 4 kids.
Wait, it was Rebecca. It was who?
Rebecca, yeah. Yeah, we've got 2 kids and 7 grandkids.
She did. She's a rabbi somewhere? Okay, so she's not the one here at Colchester.
No,
Rebecca Donna, so it's somebody else from somewhere.
This is bar
Only in those, not in those.
Oh.
The teachers there, and for a while,
We're
she
down
had.
here, we usually go home or go back to New Jersey.
I don't think she did it.
We've got 3 college graduations next year.
What's
Two
in
down here and 1 from
And
Colgate.
she just.
And then our
She
daughter
says,
is
"Oh, I
getting
think
married
you're
for
right.
the second time married.
She said, I think it's early on. Remember,
So we're down here till
Yeah.
which is very nice. Enjoyed the long day.
Yeah, no, it's,
Yes.
it was hard to see a way out of that one.
When 9/11 happened. A year and a half to get out of there.
He was across the street from the World Trade.
All right, let me see here. Looks like it should- Oh, yeah?
He was in Bangor.
Well, we can-
Manhattan. She loved it. It was a great city.
Got any more? Send them my way.
Whenever you want to start up, I'm fine.
Well, the hour is upon us, and we're going to have to be careful about time today because there is a congregational meeting that we need to get to, and Greg knows this. This, by the way, is our last Sunday school meeting until next fall. We will be, actually, we may begin in August, I'm not sure, it depends on when everything gets taken care of, but, it's been a wonderful time, and we've had some wonderful programs, and we're very lucky to wrap this up with Grace Snyder, who's a member of the religion department, and has been very faithful about speaking to this class in how many years? We won't even.
25 probably.
And today he's going to talk to us about something he'll tell you about. It should make you feel better.
That's
Thanks,
a
Greg.
completely accurate description.
What's gonna happen?
It should make you feel better.
I can't miss that one. No promises were made. So now I have to put this thing on. Apparently, if I'm gonna, I guess I'm told I'm streaming over YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have no idea if anyone's actually there or not. But I'm gonna wear this. I'm gonna wear this apparatus anyhow. And I guess I gotta turn this on. Oh, got a little handout. Pass that around. So there's a little 2-page, both sides excerpt from a fellow named Bayard Rustin. Many of you might know him, a civil rights figure, not as well known as, certainly Martin Luther King Jr. or, some of those folks, but Bayard Rustin was the person who planned the March on Washington in 1963. So he was kind of the architect of that, and somewhat of a senior figure to Martin Luther King Jr. He was born in, I think, 1906, 1907. So he was 12, 15 years old with Martin Luther King Jr. and instructed Martin Luther King Jr. in some of the techniques and philosophy of nonviolence. So that's what lies behind this little excerpt that you're looking at. And there's a
Extra ones of those.
yeah, more handout, or more of the little outlines. Okay. So, and then this other sheet is. How about we okay to stand up there? You should have brought in your stunt double for that one. So, Finland's on YouTube. We have a little off-camera action there. Okay, that's okay. So I realized I neglected to put the title for the presentation on the handout, and I think it might have come across in a couple of different versions. When I told John what the class is going to be, I thought I'd call it Peaceful Politics, the Nonviolent Mind. So that would, I think, capture what I want to get at here today. This is not a lecture. I'm afraid it's not that well organized. This is some personal reflections based on my experience of being politically active here over the last 7 or 8 years. And this sounds maybe overweening a little bit, but Gandhi called his autobiography Experiments with Truth. And I might call this sort of experiments with politics. Right? Trying to figure out how to do politics in a way that is not polarizing, that doesn't end up toxifying yourself or your opponents. And so what I'm talking about here is my experience with that. So some of you, and I've got on the outline, I have just a few, the prolegomena is just a statement that my own particular perspective on this, and some of you may know this, is that I'm coming to this from one side of the partisan political spectrum, right? I'm the chair of the Precinct 206 Democrats, and I'm the second vice chair of the Mecklenburg County Democratic Party, and there's a fair amount of Democrat in both of those offices. So that's, from the standpoint of truth in advertising, where I'm coming at this from. But that said, I'm really interested in trying to figure out, taking a step back from that partisan commitment. I'm really interested in trying to figure out, again, like I said before, how do you do political work? How do you situate yourself in the current political and media environment in such a way that you can do sustained and fruitful work that doesn't drive you crazy or doesn't drive your neighbors crazy. So that's basically what I'm up to. So part of me is explicit above the surface political activity, social organizing, political organizing, trying to figure out how you build a sustainable group. Oops, oh, there we go. All right. So that's the above the surface work, but the below the surface work is trying to figure out, how do you do this work in a sustainable way? How do you configure a kind of a spiritual persona really that can do this kind of political work? And so that, interestingly, that's what I think, draws on some of my background as a religious studies professor. Again, some of you may know this. When I come in and I address this class, it's usually in my capacity as a professor of Bible, which is my background. I do ancient Christianity and early Christian life and literature and so forth. So my expertise is in the ancient world. What I'm talking about now is more modern. But interestingly, there's been a fascinating confluence of my own background and what I'm gonna talk about today. So like I said, this is to some degree experimental, anecdotal, personal, experiential, and not some rigid chandelier-like lecture that I've got all planned out. So if you feel like you want to shoot your hand up and interject, I would welcome that, because you will all have your own experiences and insight, and I'm more than happy to combine all those together. So I thought it might be helpful in just organizing some of these thoughts I'm going to present today, just to say a little bit about how I got into this and some of the stages I went through, which are represented on this outline. So, like I said, I was I think a basically harmless and docile religious studies professor, doing ancient world research in the New Testament. I was particularly interested in second century Christianity in the city of Rome in particular, and used to enjoy going to Rome every summer and writing articles on kind of obscure byways in ancient Christianity and early Christian groups and so forth. So that was my main scholarly and vocational persona. And I'd been, as far as politics goes, I'd been, pretty active, I would say, by most standards. When some of the major elections came along, the 4-year presidential elections, I would get pretty keyed up, and we'd host phone banks at the house, and I would go out and take the kids canvassing and do that sort of thing. So, yeah, I was probably, by most standards, relatively active, politically speaking. But after the 2016 election, I was deeply concerned about that particular outcome and was just unsure, frankly, about the best thing to do at that moment, how to proceed. And so I started going up to these Moral Monday protests in Raleigh that were run by William Barber. I think, John, you'd gone up to some of these at one point, right? If I recall. And so these protests were taking place at the General Assembly, and William Barber was there. And of course, if you know William Barber, he's probably the guy right now who most, capably channels the civil rights kind of vibe and spirit and so forth, just in his commitments and his rhetoric and the way that he speaks and preaches and so forth. So I enjoyed participating in those rallies, and then driving back and forth to Raleigh, I was listening to Taylor Branch's books. It's this big, fat, 3-volume, basically scholarly treatise on the civil rights movement in the Martin Luther King Jr. years. And so I was going back and forth these demonstrations and listening to civil rights and, hearing about nonviolence and all of these things, and just driving up and down to Raleigh and cogitating on all of this. And so coming back and being in Davidson, this is now the very beginning of 2017, was seeking a way to get more involved in some sense. I felt like it was a historical moment that required something special. I feel like, and my image for this is, if I had been here and if I had been, let's say, in Selma in the summer of 1964, and the march to the Edmund Pettus Bridge was happening, would I have had the perception, first of all, just to sort of understand what was going on, and then the courage to go from being an observer to being a participant? Would I have been able to manage both of those things, step off the curb and fall in with that march? I'm not sure that I would have. I like to think that I would have. But, I think it's easy to give yourself too much credit sometimes when it comes to insider courage. But I did feel like, looking back on, where we were politically at that point, I felt like there was a need to be deeply involved. And so that's when I really kind of took my political involvement to a new level. And so, to be honest, maybe you shouldn't tell this to the dean, but I, have pretty much put my scholarly research on hold, and I'm very much dedicated now to the kinds of these political experiments with, experiments with politics. So this is now one of my primary activities. Although it is interesting, I will say that whatever else Paul was, a kind of a practical theologian and a traveler and so forth. But he was a community builder. He was, in that sense, he was trying to create small political communities. And actually, when you think about the word church, ecclesia, it's not actually kind of a theological word. It's more of a civic kind of a word. Like if you told an ancient person that you were going to the ecclesia, they would have thought you were going to the town council meeting, not to some theological or religious kind of meeting. So the funny thing was that in my work as a political organizer, I feel like I actually might have converged a little bit on the Apostle Paul and the kind of work that he was doing, and have some sort of appreciation for that I didn't have when I was working in more of a purely scholarly modality. So that was sort of an odd surprise, I would say. So as I was, thinking and ruminating about all of these things, there are a few moments that I think stick out to me, and I have this on the outline under texts and teachings that, for me, have been significant in my own thinking about how to do this kind of work. And so, perhaps because I'm a scholar of ancient Christianity and I'm supposed to know something about the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount comes to mind, and a couple of the teachings in particular on retaliation and on anger. So this material is turn the other cheek and not resisting one who is evil, right? Those are texts that have been picked up by people in the civil rights movement, and it's possible, I think, to say a lot even on these two texts. But one of the books that I have used in my New Testament class when talking about the Sermon on the Mount and nonviolence in particular is Walter Wink's book, Jesus in the Third Way. I don't know that anyone would have run across Walter Wink, but he had some great things to say, I think, on nonviolence and how that worked in Jesus' case, trying to set this in a first century context. So in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in chapter 5 of the book of Matthew, the teaching on retaliation reads as follows: "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. If someone would sue you and take your coat, give him your cloak as well." Right? That may be familiar. So Wink spends a lot of time talking about this phrase, "Do not resist one who is evil." And his reading of this is, I think, perceptive, and I have fully taken on. Like if you read this as "do not resist one who is evil," it makes it sound as if you just kind of passively roll over and let someone inflict damage on you. And Wink's claim is that actually this particular translation is really a little bit more a function of the King James translation and the time that it was executed in the early 17th century, when kings and translators working for kings weren't interested necessarily in, political responses to kingly actions, right? So there wasn't resistance. Resistance is a form of social protest was not being encouraged by King James and his translators. But if you go and you look at what's going on in the language behind "do not resist one who is evil," there's a word back there, antistani, which is not so much "do not resist," but I think "do not respond in kind." So antistani is actually when you go and you look this up and you see how the word is applied, it tends to be used in situations where there's a military response and then some kind of military counter response. So like some form of political or military oppression and then some kind of reaction that itself is violent or, oppressive in some way. And so the logic there is kind of a tit for tat. You do something to me, I do something to you in return. You do something in kind, I respond in kind. And so Wink's claim is that what's going on there is not so much saying, don't resist, don't just passively roll over and sort of accept victimhood, right? In fact, the whole point of Jesus' teaching on nonviolence in this instance is to figure out a way to respond in such a way that doesn't take the cues for your response from your adversary or from your opponent. That your response is not controlled or dictated by what is done to you, but is in fact initiated by you. And under ideal circumstances is going to be something that is going to change the equation there, and it's going to destabilize the opponent. It's not going to do the expected thing. If someone tries to hit you, that you strike back, it's going to be something counterintuitive that will kind of upset the equation. And here I'll actually kind of loop around and go down to point D here under Texts and Teachings and mention Bayard Rustin. So all of you have got this little handout. It's a 2-sided handout, and it's got a short page on either side of it. And I won't read through this whole thing. But this to me is like a great instance of what I'm talking about. And so Bayard Rustin was doing freedom rides before the freedom rides were a thing. Like the freedom rides in the 60s were, nationally known and publicized, but Bayard Rustin and some other Quaker activists were even doing this in the 40s. And so Bayard Rustin at one point, and he would sort of even go solo in some of these instances. And on this occasion, he was on a bus. I think it was 1942. It was a bus going to Nashville. And, of course, he was given the laws of the Jim Crow South at the time. When he went and sat up in the front of the bus, he was immediately sort of accosted by the driver, the bus driver who called the police came on board and were roughing him up, and then they hauled him off and they were pounding him. And you can read the whole story. They took him to the police station and they were, kicking him around and slapping him around. And they were frustrated by the fact that he didn't seem to be kind of responding as they expected to. He didn't seem to be afraid of them or what was going on, or to fear, possible consequences. And I don't have it, the text up here, but the line that I really like in here is on the back page when he's addressed by the police officer, who says menacingly, "You're supposed to be scared when you come in here." And Rustin says, "I'm fortified by truth, justice, and Christ. There's no need for me to fear." He was flabbergasted and for a time completely at a loss for words. He finally said to another officer, you can finish that sentence off. So that to me is just, that's priceless. What I like about that is just what I like about that is the incomprehension of the police officer. He just can't figure out what's going on. That seems to be that's one of the best examples of the kind of action that I think Walter Wink would say is going on in the Sermon on the Mount. Because when you offer your right cheek to someone who's just hit you on the left cheek, right? That is, according to Wink's reading, that's not just passivity. That's actually getting in there and changing the course and the logic of retaliation. And there may be many ways to do that. And that's where I think creativity comes into this. And not just creativity, but I think a certain kind of preparation as well. Like you can't, Bayard Rustin did not head into that police station unprepared for what might happen. Same with Rosa Parks, right? Rosa Parks didn't just happen. There were years of preparation, both kind of planning for the event itself, but I think years of spiritual preparation as well. And here's where I'll sort of loop back around and connect again with the sequence on the handout. Oh, I've actually got something here on the. Let me bracket the teaching on anger. I may come back to that. But just to mention that Bayard Rustin was sort of a complicated upbringing, but he ended up being raised by his grandparents, who were fairly devout Quakers, and raised him in the Quaker tradition of nonviolence, which many of you might be familiar with. People like George Fox and John Woolman, and in the whole tradition of Quaker nonviolence, both in the 19th century in the slavery movement, and they were pretty early. John, I would defer to you on this point, but I think of the Quakers not necessarily as perfect in any means, but it seems like they kind of got to what I would say are enlightened insights before most other major denominations. Somehow they figured out that slavery and the practice of enslavement was wrong. And somehow the Quakers figured out that ways of thinking about sort of gender and male superiority was also wrong. There was a tradition of female preachers and teachers in the Quaker tradition that predated female preachers in most other traditions. And so the Quakers got to this, I think, before most other Christian groups. So I've always found them kind of inspirational. And there was a time for probably 5 or 6 years when I was kind of a regular down there at the Quaker Meeting House. I was, I guess, kind of a Quakertarian. Sort of a mashup between a Quaker and a Presbyterian. And the funny thing is, as it turned out, is that when I first came down here to Davidson, I'd been in the South for a couple summers in college, but I hadn't really lived in the South for a long period of time. And I thought, come down to Davidson College, who do I know in North Carolina? I wasn't quite sure whether I fit in down here. Well, as it turns out, that some of my ancestors were Quakers and had set up there was a colony of Quakers over in Alamance County over by Snow Camp, and there was a flour mill called Lindley Mill over there, and a little Spring Creek Quaker church that my ancestor Thomas Lindley had set up in 1751. So the Quakers, my Quaker ancestors, were down here, so I thought that was kind of serendipitous, actually, that I should be adopting some of the teachings of the Quakers and feel like this was something I wanted to engage with. And not to go off and talk at length about George Fox, who's the founder of Quakerism, but as a character, as a person, I found him tremendously inspirational. One of the basic commitments of Quaker theology is the fact that there is, so the saying goes, there is that of God in every person. And so the conviction is that in every person, man, woman, black, white, everybody, there is that of God present in that person. And that's true in a very lively way that is not typical of most Christian denominations at all. There's some sort of, it's pantheistic, or that's not quite the right word, but there is a lively sense that Quakers do believe that there is some aspect of God in all people. And I think that's what really undergirds the kind of radical egalitarianism that characterizes their social ethics, right? That, like, if there is that of God in, people that I'm enslaving, then something is wrong with me enslaving them. That's just something deeply offensive about that practice. If there is that of God in men and women equally, then perhaps I should be listening to female preachers. And it seems like George Fox, as a person, again, he's sort of like Bayard Rustin in that idea. I don't know where this guy came from or how he accomplished what he did, but some of his commitments to equality, to not swearing oaths. This guy, so for example, one of the things that I find kind of charming about George Fox is in 17th century England, it was a deeply hierarchical society, and you would address people from sort of superior social classes, with formal language. You would take off your hat in the presence of social superiors, whether they were gentlemen and you were just sort of the peasantry, or whether it was a magistrate or an official of some kind. You naturally took off your hat. George Fox would not take off his hat for anybody under any circumstances. It was a theological principle with him, it seems like, that he would simply never do it, and it drove people crazy. Even when he went into the courtroom and he was arrested multiple times and thrown in jail multiple times and just beaten savagely multiple times, he would not address people in honorific language. He would not take off his damn hat. And no one could figure that out. And he just wouldn't do it. So he just had to be physically manhandled to get rid of his hat. So in that sense, he strikes me as a little bit like Bayard Rustin in that regard. And so I found George Fox a fascinating person to think with when it came down to figuring out, okay, how do I configure myself? And so George Fox and Quaker theology is a big piece of my own thinking on this. And one of the little sayings here that the Quakers have, and I think this is from I'm not sure what the Quaker book of, it's not the Quaker book of doctrine, but there's sort of a Quaker book of teachings. John, do you know what that is called?
No.
Not to put you on the spot, but
Oliver Cromwell too, believe it or not.
Yeah. Oliver Cromwell,
Said the same thing.
did it really?
I can see you in the bowels of Christ.
Oh, yeah.
Consider it possible that you may be mistaken.
Yeah, maybe they picked this up from Oliver Cromwell. Yeah. Well, I know Cromwell and Fox were, connected, let's say. But this is a maxim, again, for my own thinking. I think this this is something good to put on a yellow sticky and put on your study carrel or on your dashboard or, something like that. Think it possible that you may be mistaken. So, and what I like about that is it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily require you to not commit to something. But what it does is it creates a space for thinking and reflection that I think is pretty crucial, again, to cultivating a nonviolent mind, a nonviolent attitude. Gets space in there to where you can then not simply react, not give tit for tat, not trade a counter blow for a blow, but reflect a little bit about what it is you're going to do and then change and sort of change the equation at that point. Excuse me. So the Quakers have been an important part of my own thinking on this. And then both the Quakers and Mahatma Gandhi were a part of the whole chapter of nonviolence in civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Lawson and all of these other Jim Lawson, right? Who actually went to India and studied with some followers of Gandhi and brought back the tradition of nonviolence. Bayard Rustin also went to India, both after Gandhi was assassinated in 1948. And so, as I was listening to, going back to me driving back and forth to Raleigh and listening to some of these civil rights stories, I thought it would be important to go back and spend some time with Gandhi and see how he was influencing the civil rights movement. How many of you have seen the Gandhi movie? I think that's probably most of us may have seen. It's a big 3.5 hour sprawling epic, and it's kind of what religious studies scholars would call a hagiography, right? It projects an image of Gandhi that is saint-like. And some of the recent biographies of Gandhi have been a little more critical of some of his stances in South Africa, and amid a younger generation of activists, Gandhi is getting some severe critiques for, his time in South Africa and the fact that basically what he was after in South Africa was right for Indians and Indian expats, and not so much for indigenous people in South Africa, and that some of the things he did in retrospect seem quite racist, and other ways that Gandhi behaved, other things that he did are certainly deserving of critique. But Gandhi himself would, I think, be completely fine to have that happen. Right? He was not a person who, took himself too seriously, and so I think he would be receptive to the critique that he has been subjected to. But for me, he was a just reading some of his writings. There was a little collection that was, I don't know again if people have seen this, but if you could write this down, a little collection of Gandhi's sayings by Thomas Merton on nonviolence. It's a little short pamphlet, and Merton goes through, and of course Merton himself is a fascinating religious and spiritual figure, very much caught up in protests in the 60s, and himself an advocate of nonviolence. So Merton has excerpted a lot of Gandhi's material that I found significant in my own thinking about the approach to politics, and I've just kind of randomly grabbed a few of these and put these in here. So the first one, the sword of the Satyagrahi, is love and the unshakable firmness that comes with it. And so the Satyagraha is Gandhi's own terminology for what he would call like truth force. And this is a kind of a better understanding, I think, of nonviolence, because if people think of nonviolence, you tend to think of something that's not something else, right? It's like violence is there, and what I'm doing is not that, which is kind of again, taking your cue from the thing and saying it's not that, right? The first point of reference is what you're not doing. And satyagraha, I think, as a concept is preferable, because what's involved in Gandhi's understanding of nonviolence is not passivity at all. It's not, and that's where Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., I think, and most of these people, Jim Lawson, all these people, what we're doing here is not passive resistance. I mean, there may be things about it that appear passive, but it is active. This is active resistance. But the activity, the energy of the resistance doesn't happen on the plane of physical retaliation or physical response. It happens at another level. It is, like Gandhi would say, it's soul force, and it's rooted in an attitude of truth. And ultimately, Gandhi would say, love of enemy that prevents you from attacking an enemy or responding violently to an enemy. But it by no means, requires you to roll over and again, or do not resist one who is evil. Gandhi resisted evil. Gandhi resisted those who are evil, as did the civil rights people, right? But just the mode of resistance was different. So this particular quote, I've always found just really affecting in my own thinking about this, because it's so easy, I think, in political work to be motivated by anger or animus. And the flip side of anger and animus is fear, I think, because sometimes you're angry at something, but the flip side of that is fear about that thing at which you're generating anger. And concrete. Well, I think that smacks of a professorial detour. I'm not even going to go down that. I'm not even going to go down that alley. But the idea that you can be involved politically without that kind of angry response, and then the fear that comes along with it, allows you to interact, I think, genuinely and authentically with people who are your opponents. And again, I won't use the word for enemy, because it actually, the next quote, it's sort of this takes me to the next quote. In the lexicon of satyagraha, of soul force, there is no word for enemy, which I like that, in the sense that, if you already start applying labels to things and you label somebody as your enemy, then that dynamic is already half set up. But if you can think in terms not of an enemy, but maybe an opponent, or maybe an adversary, or someone who is at this point in time, ranged against you for who knows what reasons, that I think softens the possible interactions that you can have with people. And so what I was going to say, the little anecdote I was going to relate. We were recently down at Mecklenburg County Democratic Party headquarters. Kamala Harris came there a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of preparations going on. So one of the things we had to do was take off the doors to the office. And the Secret Service were crawling all over the place and telling us we had to do this, that, and the other thing. And so they had some of the folks from the building maintenance people, and there was a guy there, this big, tall guy. And at one point, when he realized where he was, he very loudly proclaimed that he didn't care for Democrats at all, and he was a Trump supporter. And I wasn't there for this initial interaction, but apparently the people who were there responded well to him, and they actually said, "Well, that's interesting, and tell us about that." And so they ended up having a little conversation with Eric, is his name was, and turns out that he's a kind of an independent contractor. He has his own business, handyman business, and it turned out in conversation with him that he's a big fan of Obamacare, that without healthcare, he wouldn't have been able to run his own, he wouldn't have been able to actually survive as a businessman. And so people homed in on that a little bit. Well, that's a bit counterintuitive. That, you're behind a guy who wants to take all that away, and you're against someone who wants to give that to you. And that seemed to be a little bit of a crack in the, in the armor there. And so over the course of the week, and I met Eric a little bit later in the week, and he's a funny guy, big, tall guy, kind of short, bristly hair. He has this monster pickup truck, black pickup truck. It's got a boat horn on it. It's got a Trump train sticker on the back. And then on the windshield, it's got, like you see on some of the, it's some of the like impish little kid taking a leak. You know what that is? You've seen it, right? So there's one he's got sort of like a Trump head on that little kid taking a leak on a picture of Joe Biden. So all of that is on this guy's pickup truck. So it's all, external signs. This is not someone that, you want to necessarily be interacting with. And there might be some sense of, animus and anger, but also a certain kind of recoiling or fear about because, again, it seems like sometimes, someone like this fellow, Eric, are projecting a kind of a belligerence and a kind of an in-your-faceness that can promote a fearful response. Well, the point, if you don't buy into that logic, if you don't fear that, and if you could find a way through the practice of satyagraha, which is a long discipline, this is not something that you can just conjure up immediately, then there's no reason to fear that. There's no reason to fear that person. Even though some of the external signs and signifiers might make you go, oh, yeah, dude, his pickup truck and his boat horn and he's 6'4" and all this stuff. If you don't hate that person, there's no necessary response of fear. And that lack of response of fear or recoiling opens up a possibility of conversation. So, so Eric and I have had a couple of nice phone calls. I got his cell phone number and we're gonna get together for lunch. So, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from him, but that's kind of an interaction, again, a Davidson professor would not, our social worlds would not really intersect. And so it's a real privilege for me just to be able to sit down and spend time with him. But the whole point of this is that some of what is going on here, I think, opens up the possibility for interactions like that. A couple others, just to sort of make my way through these last two comments from Gandhi. There was a story of a journalist who once asked Gandhi if he could state his philosophy of life in 25 words or less. And of course, here's a guy who's generated literally millions of words in correspondence and speeches and everything like that. So getting it down to 25 words, oh my God, how you can do that? Well, Gandhi's response, I can do it in 3. And it was renounce all fruit, which is actually a phrase from the Isha Upanishad. And it's also a phrase from the Bhagavad Gita, which, incidentally, Gandhi sort of treated as pretty much a devotional manual for his entire life. He said that there was not a day that went by that he did not read something from the Bhagavad Gita. So I will also say that partly through Gandhi, I've gotten very interested in, the Bhagavad Gita and some of the South Asian spiritual literature that he drew his own kind of thinking and spiritual approach to politics from. So renounce all fruit is, I think, a great piece of advice. So by renounce all fruit, what Gandhi meant is detach your actions from their expected results, right? Work in such a way that this is not to say that you're indifferent to outcomes, that you don't care about outcomes, that I'm just doing my socially pure kind of thing and thinking highly of myself. That's not what's going on. That you're obligated to sort of plan and strategize and think in such a way that you're aiming towards the good as you see it and as you understand it. But you can't get hung up or connected or attached to that outcome. Because if you get attached to that outcome, you will be going through endless cycles of either elation if that outcome is achieved, or depression if that outcome is not achieved. You will always be oscillating up and down and back and forth. And oh my God, if this does not describe our political reality at this moment, I don't think anything does, right? How do you, just in getting up and, reading the newspaper, watching the news, go through all these cycles of ups and downs and elations and hopes and frustrations and so forth. And that is so taxing. It's just exhausting when it comes down to being political. And so is there a way to step out from all of that, to just back away from that in such a way that your political action and your mind is sustainable and won't get burnt out as you go about your political work, or even just your political thinking and understanding and so forth. And this is, and I know we need to leave because I think our meeting starts at 10:40 over there, so I'll end on this point. This renounce all fruit phrase is, I think, leads into this next one, always on vacation. So at one point, a journalist had asked, was talking to Gandhi and was reflecting on Gandhi's habits of work. And Gandhi was, again, incredible from the standpoint of his ability to simply work. Like, this was a guy, he slept maybe from 1 in the morning until, maybe midnight until 3 in the morning. And then he got up and was writing letters. And then he was meeting with world leaders and traveling, and just in incredibly contentious environments, right? In India, where there's the caste system, there's the colonial system, there's the struggles between Hindus and Muslims, right? Just incredible vortex of millions and millions of people. And so he would work 21 hours a day. And so some journalist at one point said to Gandhi, geez, you need a vacation. And Gandhi said, I'm always on vacation. And I think it's because of this previous remark, renounce all fruit. If you can find a way to do the work that is fulfilling and meaningful and good and important without getting attached to results, then that finally sets you free to, kind of liberates you to be free in your political action, to do the best work that you know how to do, but not get caught up in all the entanglements of, did this work? Again, you may try something, it may not work, and you go, that did not work. And you go back to the drawing board. I'm going to figure out something that does work. That may not work, and you just keep doing that. And so that, I think, is the discipline that I think would be helpful to a lot. I've certainly found all these things helpful. We can't get onto these other things, but I'll kind of wind it down there. Maybe you've got some final remark. If I have a final piece of advice, I would just say, get off screens. Get off screens, because the media environment is so much about provoking a response, an immediate response. Like, it was hard enough for George Fox and Mohandas Gandhi to learn how not to react. But in the current media environment, in which stimulus and response and like anger and clicks is monetized, right? I mean, all of those things accelerate this unhelpful dynamic of immediate reaction as opposed to distance and thoughtful response. So I'll leave you with that, and we'll call it quits there.
Thank you so much.
Sure. You all got to go to the meeting here. Maybe I should go to the meeting too.
My thinking was watch Hallmark, it's all about love.
What's that?
Watch Hallmark, it's all about love.
Well, and the part of it is, I mean, it's easy to come up with, like, sometimes you
little like Hallmark card axioms like that, it's easy to just sort of dismiss that, oh, it's just cliche. But, I mean, those things are actually really true. They just have to be sort of built out from actual experience. They're easy to dismiss if it's in a Hallmark card, but you go, gosh, that really is actually true. If you could put it to words.
Thank you so much.
Sure, no, it's fun to, hopefully there's some value here. So thanks for coming. What's your name, by the way?
Well, show me.
Well, I'm Greg Snyder
And
and
I'm Jane.
Jane. Good to meet you guys.
Thank you.
All right, see ya.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of right over there.
Just an intro, good read.